Hi, I'm Ed Bacon, the rector of All Saints Church, Pasadena. Whoever you are and wherever you find yourself on the journey of faith, I hope that you'll find something here that speaks to you. Welcome.
May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be aligned with your love, O God, our strength, our courage, and our freedom. Amen. Last Friday, a 20-year-old young man in Newtown, Connecticut, murdered his mother in their home, then went to the Sandy Hook Elementary School and gunned down 20 6- and 7-year-olds in their classrooms, along with the school principal, the school's psychologist, and 4 classroom teachers, and then he killed himself. Yesterday morning, I received an email about the Newtown, Connecticut murders of these precious elementary school children. The email subject was identified as "Such Sadness." It was from Archbishop Desmond Tutu. One of his friends had reached out in pain to the Archbishop, and he had responded to a couple of dozen of us in the following way. Dear friend, I thought this might help a little. Here in South Africa, we awoke to screaming headlines about this awful carnage. Oh dear, what is happening to us? We recently had our own massacre here in Maracana. Please know we are upholding you all, especially the affected families. What must the father of this young man be feeling that he killed his mother and all those others, adults and children? Oh no. He continued, Emmanuel does not give good advice from a safe distance. Emmanuel is God with us. By entering the fiery furnace, and is there in the furnace, in the massacre, in the dying, the shooting, in the anguish. May our God, Emmanuel, wipe your tears, all of you, and embrace you and comfort you all, including the remaining members of the gunman's family. God is weeping too, that God's children can do this to one another. Much love and blessings for Advent, Christmas, and 2013. Archbishop Tutu in that email articulated for us what I believe to be the best our tradition offers in understanding and coping with the kind of nightmarish suffering that actually takes place in human life. In the Archbishop's missive, there is no expression of some false notion of an omnipotent God. Few of us buy that theology. I certainly do not. There is not a good God or a just God who is also omnipotent. It is clear that God does not stop the killing of children, does not stop war, genocide, horrible suffering, torture. That is our job description, not God's. We ask, in a moment like this, we ask God, why? While in the same moment, God is asking us, why? In the Archbishop's missive, there is also no expression of some punitive, bloodthirsty God who retaliates and punishes people for disobedience. I was embarrassed for Christianity when a perverse, distorted notion of a condemning God found a Christian minister to give that notion expression. But Mike Huckabee went on Fox News and said the following: "We ask why there is violence in our schools, but we've systematically removed God from our schools. Should we be so surprised that schools would become a place of carnage because we've made it a place where we don't want to talk about eternity, life, what responsibility means, accountability? That we're not just going to have to be accountable to the police if they catch us, but one day we will stand before a holy God in judgment. And if we don't believe that, then we don't fear that." I do not believe that God is a mixture of a police officer and judge in the sky, meting out pain and death to innocent children because their elders don't lead them in the Lord's Prayer every morning in their classrooms. In the face of this carnage, however, we are left with the question of, how is God loving and powerful and compassionate in the face of the slaughter of these precious children and these precious public servants and this mentally disturbed young man and his mother? Archbishop Tutu points you and me to our tradition that reminds us this morning that the God we long for and wait to be born as a child in a manger during Advent and Christmas is the God we call Emmanuel, which is Hebrew for God with us. It is the God who did not prevent the king from trying to torture Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace, but rather God entered into that furnace with them. You see, in the best of the Jewish prophetic tradition, God is known throughout history as the suffering God, taking flesh in a suffering servant. Our tradition says that there is no human suffering that our God does not enter. And in that divine participation in our human suffering, God transforms you and me into being suffering servants and the community of suffering servants. The aha moment of our tradition as it evolved was that God is always with us, and that God became flesh and dwelt among us. And that enfleshed, embodied God, the complete human being. Jesus told us that because that God dwells inside us, that you and I can do even greater things than Jesus did. Richard Rohr writes that many of the happiest and most peaceful people I know love a God who walks with crucified people and thus reveals and redeems and transforms their plight as his own. For them, Jesus is not observing human suffering from a distance, Archbishop Tutu's giving advice from afar, but is somehow in human suffering with us and for us. He includes our suffering in the co-redemption of the world as all creation groans in one great act of giving birth. God enters our suffering to teach us how to love and to care for one another. Only sufferers can be saviors. Only people who have suffered in some way can save one another. There is something about those who not only suffer, but who experience God entering into their suffering, who, in Rohr's terms, pass over to live inside a much bigger picture. Pass over to live inside a picture that's much greater than our ego, than our individualistic self-absorption. Something happens deep within the souls of those who suffer and who become aware of God's suffering with them and inside them, God with us. They undergo God's love and compassion. The most intimate experience you can have with God is to discover God in the place you hurt the most or where you have the deepest needs. It is there that we are called by Jesus to undergo God's compassion. And that makes you, that ordains you, whether you're a priest or layperson, that ordains you, in fact, to be a part of God's with us suffering servant band. God is the God of all who suffer. And where there is suffering, there you find God. That is why Jesus says that when I was in prison and when I was hungry and when I was without clothing and when I was a stranger and when I was sick, you came and you visited me. God is literally in the fiery furnace of the suffering of every human being, and the way you and I find God to be real is either to discover God in our own suffering or to discover God in our solidarity with those who are suffering this morning. That is why it is important for you and me to understand that our sisters and brothers in Newtown, Connecticut are the same as we are. They are us. My grandchildren are the ages of those who were killed Friday. And my wife and I have 3 adult children who are classroom teachers. We suffer in a deep way with our sisters and brothers in Newtown, Connecticut this morning. There's a strange irony going on inside me this morning because today, according to the liturgical calendar of the Anglican tradition, today is Joy Sunday. We save the pink candle on the Advent wreath to light today. Because in the third Sunday of Advent, the lessons have something to do with joy, of rejoicing. Rejoice. Again, I say rejoice. Paul summons us this morning. How can we be joyful in the midst of this kind of suffering? As I held that question in prayer, a song from my boyhood came to me. The song goes, "This joy that I have, the world didn't give it to me. This joy that I have, the world didn't give it to me. This joy that I have, the world didn't give it to me. The world didn't give it, and the world can't take it away." You see, when you and I prepare in our hearts a manger in the places where we suffer and the places where we are so needy, and we prepare for the suffering servant to be enfleshed and to be given to us there, that is a moment of deep and great joy that the world cannot give. It is the case that once one passes over to live inside a much bigger picture, inside the community of those who know God to be with them in the nightmare or fiery furnace of those who are suffering, then we are also called not only to joy, but also to be called to be healers, wounded healers, who not only know how to grieve and mourn, but also those who know that they must take effective, persistent, persevering, prayerful, political action. According to the Centers for Disease Control, in 2011, there were 15,953 murders in the United States. And 11,101 were caused by firearms. Today, 30 Americans will die because of firearms. Because we have not found the political will and organization to put a stop to our idolatrous worship of the gun. We have a responsibility to work for better gun safety measures, including mandatory background checks, a ban on high-capacity clips, and semi-automatic weapons. What are weapons that are made for soldiers to carry into battlefield in any way doing in the hands of private citizens? And we must bring an end to the various loopholes that allow for easy purchase and a thriving black market. Marion Rod Edelman yesterday, the leader of the Children's Defense Fund, said, how young do the victims have to be and how many children need to die before we stop the proliferation of guns in our nation and the killing of innocents? Noting that 119,079 children and teens have been killed by gun violence since 1979, when such statistics were collected, Edelman said that this number is larger than the number of Americans killed in any of the 20th century's largest wars. She wrote, "Where is the anti-war movement to protect children from pervasive gun violence here at home?" I've had a conversation with our children's minister, Laura Thornton, and Francisco Garcia, our director of Peace and Justice. And we've talked about how scandalous it is that this country will go through one of these horrendous experiences of human carnage because we have not done what we need to do to control guns being in the hands of those who would use them this way. And then we forget about it until the next carnage. That has to come to a stop for those of us who are in the band of the suffering servant. And so they and I promise to you today and ask that you promise to us today that this church will not stop until meaningful action comes to be and that we become supportive of our president and place emphasis on the Congress and the great National Rifle Association and the huge, rich, wealthy lobby in Congress to say, this must change. Maybe one of the things that can happen today and the rest of these days of Advent and next Monday night when we gather to celebrate the Prince of Peace coming and residing not only in that humble stable but also in the humblest parts of our lives. Maybe what we need to do is undergo the visitation in the places where we suffer, so that we can be transformed to be deep instruments of joy, deep instruments of healing, and deep instruments of taking care of our children. Amen.